When a retired man bought a quiet country home, he was only searching for peace, not a mystery. But beneath that quiet country home, hidden for over a century, lay a perfectly preserved underground garden. Who built this secret world? And why was it buried so carefully from history? Please support us by subscribing to the channel and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Edward Lawson had spent 40 years in the chaos of Chicago, working long hours as an insurance agent, watching life pass by through office windows and endless traffic jams. At 68, he made a decision that surprised even his own children. He bought a quiet country home tucked deep in the rolling hills of Vermont. The house was old, weathered, and carried a silence so thick it almost felt alive. But to Edward, that silence was peace. Every morning, he stepped outside with a cup of black coffee, breathing in the crisp air as sunlight stretched across his overgrown backyard. The garden, however, was far from peaceful. Thick ivy strangled broken stone borders, and wild grass swallowed what once might have been a carefully designed landscape. It was neglected, forgotten. One afternoon, determined to reclaim the land, Edward grabbed a shovel and began clearing the mess. As he drove the blade into the soil, something felt off. The ground resisted in a strange way, hard, almost hollow beneath the surface. He paused. That sound, it didn't belong to dirt. It echoed. And in that moment, standing alone in his quiet backyard, Edward felt something shift, like he had just disturbed a secret that had been buried far too long. Edward Lawson couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the ground beneath his feet. That hollow echo lingered in his mind long after he stepped back from the first strike of his shovel. For a man who had spent decades living a predictable, structured life, this was something entirely different. He told himself it was nothing. Maybe an old pipe, a buried rock, something ordinary. But he didn't walk away. Instead, Edward tightened his grip on the shovel and drove it back into the same spot, harder this time. The metal blade scraped against something solid, producing a sharp, unnatural sound that sent a chill up his spine. This wasn't soil. It wasn't wood either. It was stone. Kneeling down, he brushed away the dirt with his gloved hands. Slowly, carefully. A flat surface began to emerge, smooth, cold, and unmistakably shaped by human hands. His breath grew heavier as he cleared more of it. This wasn't just a random slab. The edges were too precise, too intentional. Minutes turned into an hour, and before he realized it, Edward had carved out a small clearing in the earth. What lay beneath wasn't just stone. It was the curved outline of something architectural. An arch, a perfectly formed, hand-carved stone archway, buried beneath layers of soil and roots. Edward froze. "What is this?" he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible in the stillness of the countryside. There was no one around to answer him. No passing cars, no neighbors, just the wind brushing through the trees, and that growing, undeniable sense that he had stumbled onto something he was never meant to find. His heart began to pound, not from the physical labor, but from something deeper. A mix of excitement and unease twisted together in his chest. Every instinct told him to stop, to cover it back up, to pretend he had never seen it. But curiosity won. It always did. Edward grabbed a small hand trowel and continued digging around the arch, exposing more of its structure. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each stone fit together seamlessly, as if it had been built to last centuries. Even more unsettling, there were no cracks, no signs of collapse. Whatever this was, it had been preserved, protected from the world above. As the opening became clearer, Edward noticed something else. The dirt inside the arch felt different, looser. as if it had once been disturbed and then settled again. Buried, but deliberately. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just something that had been lost to time. It had been hidden. Edward hesitated, staring into the dark, partially revealed entrance. The sunlight barely touched its interior, leaving the inside cloaked in shadow. It was like looking into a void, silent. Waiting. He swallowed hard. For a brief moment, he considered calling someone. Maybe the local authorities, a historian, anyone. But the thought of sharing this discovery of losing control over it made him pause. No, not yet. This was his, at least for now, with a deep breath. Edward reached for a nearby rake and began pulling away the last layers of soil blocking the entrance. Clumps of dirt slid down, revealing more stone, and then something that made his entire body go still. A step, then another, a staircase, leading down. The realization hit him like a wave. This wasn't just an old structure. It was an entrance to something beneath his backyard, something hidden for decades, maybe longer. Edward slowly stood up, staring down into the darkness as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows behind him. The quiet country home he had bought for peace and simplicity was no longer what it seemed. It was sitting on top of a secret, and he was the first person to find it. Alone. Edward Lawson stood at the edge of the newly uncovered staircase, his breath slow but heavy, as if the air itself had thickened. The late afternoon sun hovered low behind him, casting long golden beams that barely reached past the first few steps. Beyond that, there was only darkness. A darkness that felt untouched. He wiped his hands on his jeans, suddenly aware of how quiet everything had become. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. The world above ground felt distant, now irrelevant compared to what lay beneath his feet. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. And yet, he didn't move away. Instead, Edward turned back toward the shed and grabbed an old flashlight he had barely used since moving in. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear alone, but from anticipation. Something deep inside him needed to know. When he returned to the opening, the silence greeted him again, thicker this time, almost oppressive. He clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the stone steps more clearly now. They spiraled gently downward, each one worn smooth, but still perfectly intact. No debris, no collapse. It was as if the staircase had been waiting, preserved in time. Edward hesitated at the top step. Then, slowly, he placed his foot down. The sound echoed, not loudly, but enough to send a chill through his entire body. He took another step, and another. With each movement, the temperature seemed to drop. The warm air of the late afternoon disappeared, replaced by something cooler, damp, almost alive. The scent hit him next a mixture of earth, stone, and something faintly organic. Not decay. Not quite. Something older. His grip tightened around the flashlight as the beam danced across the curved stone walls. The craftsmanship was astonishing. Every inch of the structure looked deliberate, carefully designed. This wasn't some forgotten storage cellar. This was something far more intentional. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, Edward froze. The light revealed a space that made his heart skip. It wasn't a tunnel. It was a room. No, more than that. It opened into a wide underground chamber, far larger than he expected, stretching beyond the reach of his flashlight. The ceiling arched gracefully overhead, supported by carved stone pillars. But what truly stopped him cold was what filled the space. Plants. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but as he slowly swept the beam across the room, the truth became undeniable. Green, everywhere. Ferns with delicate, curling leaves. Vines creeping along the stone walls, clusters of low plants spread across the ground like a living carpet. How? The word escaped him before he could stop it. This place had been buried, completely sealed, and yet it was alive. Edward took a cautious step forward, his boots pressing into soft, slightly damp soil. The air here was different, humid, almost perfectly balanced. Not suffocating, not stale, sustained. As if this hidden world had been breathing on its own for decades. Then something caught his eye, a flicker of white in the darkness. He slowly turned the flashlight toward it, and his chest tightened. There, in the center of the chamber, stood a cluster of flowers. White lilies, perfectly bloomed. Their petals glowed softly under the beam of light, untouched, unbroken, impossibly pure. Edward's heart pounded in his ears. These should be dead, he whispered. But they weren't. They were thriving. And in that moment, standing alone in a hidden garden that should not exist, Edward felt something shift deep inside him. Not just curiosity anymore. Something heavier. Because this wasn't just a discovery. It was a contradiction. A place buried for what could have been a century. Still alive. Still growing. Still waiting. And suddenly, the question that filled his mind wasn't just how this place existed, but why it had been hidden in the first place. Edward Lawson couldn't move. The sight of those white lilies, delicate, luminous, impossibly alive, held him in place like a spell. His mind struggled to make sense of it, to force logic into something that clearly defied it. This place had been buried, sealed, forgotten, and yet it was thriving. He slowly stepped closer, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The air wrapped around him like a living presence, cool, damp, but strangely comforting. It wasn't the suffocating stillness he expected from an underground space. It felt balanced, sustained, engineered. Edward crouched beside the lilies, his hand hovering just inches above the petals. He hesitated before touching them, as if afraid they might disappear the moment he made contact. But they didn't. His fingers brushed against one bloom, silky, fresh, real. He pulled his hand back quickly, his breath catching in his throat. "This isn't possible," he whispered. But it was, and in that moment, something shifted inside him. Not just curiosity, not even shock, but understanding. This wasn't an accident. This place hadn't survived by chance. It had been designed to survive. Edward stood up slowly, raising the flashlight higher. Now that his eyes were adjusting, he began to notice details he had missed before. Small openings along the upper edges of the chamber, barely visible, allowed thin beams of sunlight to filter through from above. Hidden shafts, perfectly placed. Ventilation, light control, moisture balance. Every element worked together in silent harmony. Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing, and that realization sent a deeper chill through him than the cold air ever could. Because people don't create something like this just to abandon it. Edward turned slowly, scanning the chamber with a new perspective. What had first seemed like a miracle of nature now revealed itself as something far more deliberate, a sanctuary. A hidden garden, a place meant to be protected from the outside world. But protected from what? His mind raced. Warmth, fear, loss, or something more personal, something no one else was ever meant to see. He moved deeper into the chamber, each step more cautious than the last. The flashlight beam flickered slightly as his grip tightened. The beauty of the place was undeniable, but now it carried a weight, a presence that pressed against his chest. This place had a story, and it wasn't a simple one. Edward's light passed over one of the stone pillars, and he froze. There, carved faintly into the surface, were markings. Not random, not damage. Intentional. He stepped closer, his heart pounding as he brushed away a thin layer of moisture from the stone. Letters, symbols, worn by time, but still there. A name, or at least part of one. Edward swallowed hard. A person. This wasn't just architecture. It was personal. Suddenly, the entire chamber felt different. The plants, the flowers, the carefully constructed space, it wasn't just a hidden garden. It was someone's creation, someone's refuge, someone's secret. And just like that, Edward no longer felt like an explorer. He felt like an intruder. The silence around him deepened, pressing in from every direction. Even his own breathing sounded too loud now, echoing softly against the stone walls. He turned in a slow circle, the flashlight beam sweeping across the chamber once more, but this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt watched, not in a literal sense. There was no movement, no sound, but the presence of whoever built this place lingered in every detail, every carved stone, every living plant that had somehow endured the passage of time. Edward stepped back slightly, his pulse racing. "I shouldn't be here," he murmured. And yet, he didn't leave, because beneath the unease, there was something stronger. A pull! A need to understand. To uncover the truth buried beneath decades of silence. He looked once more at the lilies, those impossible flowers that had survived against all odds, and felt something shift inside him again. Not fear. Responsibility? Whoever had created this place was gone. But what they built remained. Hidden, forgotten. Until now. Edward Lawson straightened his posture, his grip on the flashlight steadying as his fear slowly transformed into something else: determination. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a story waiting to be uncovered. And whether he was ready or not, he was now part of it. Edward Lawson didn't sleep that night. He sat in his dimly lit living room, the silence of the countryside now feeling heavier than ever. The same quiet he once craved had turned into something else, something watchful, almost suffocating. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the lilies, glowing in the darkness. Alive. Impossible. By morning, Edward had made a decision. He wouldn't tell anyone, not yet. Instead, he pulled out his old laptop and began searching. Property records, historical maps, anything tied to the land beneath his home. Hours passed as he dug through archives, his eyes growing tired, but his mind sharper than ever. Then he found something. A faded document, dated over a century ago. A name appeared again, partially damaged, but unmistakable. Eliza Whitmore. Edward leaned closer to the screen, his heart beginning to race. The name matched what he had seen carved into the stone below. This wasn't a coincidence. He kept reading. Eliza Whitmore, listed as the original owner of the property, described as an artist, reclusive, unusual. And then, nothing. The records ended abruptly. No death certificate, no sale history, no explanation. As if she had simply vanished. Edward sat back slowly, the weight of the discovery settling into his chest. "This isn't just a garden," he whispered. "This is hers." The realization changed everything. For the next 2 days, Edward returned to the underground chamber alone. He documented everything: photos, sketches, notes, the air, the structure, the plants. He measured distances, studied the light shafts, even touched the stone walls as if they might reveal something more. But the deeper he went, the more one truth became unavoidable. This place was far beyond him. On the 3rd day, standing once again in front of the white lilies, Edward exhaled slowly. "I can't do this alone." The words echoed softly in the chamber. And just like that, the decision was made. Later that afternoon, Edward made a call. 2 days later, a dark SUV pulled into his gravel driveway. A woman stepped out, first mid-50s, sharp eyes, composed posture. She carried herself with quiet authority. "Mr. Lawson." Edward nodded. "That's me. I'm Dr. Amelia Brooks. You said on the phone this was unusual." Behind her, another man stepped out taller, slightly younger, carrying a worn leather bag. "Daniel Hayes." He introduced himself with a small nod. "Botanical specialist." Edward hesitated for just a moment. This was it. No turning back. "Follow me," he said. Minutes later, the three of them stood at the edge of the hidden staircase. "Doctor?" Brooks raised an eyebrow. "You found this in your backyard?" Edward didn't answer. He simply turned on his flashlight and began descending. They followed. As they reached the bottom, silence took over once again. But this time, it wasn't just Edward feeling it. "Doctor." Brooks stopped mid-step. "Oh my God." Her voice was barely a whisper. Daniel moved past her slowly, his eyes scanning the chamber. When the beam of his flashlight landed on the plants, he froze completely. "That's not possible," he said, almost under his breath. Edward watched them carefully. The shock, the disbelief, it mirrored exactly what he had felt days earlier. But now, hearing it from them, it made everything more real. Daniel knelt beside the lilies, examining them with trembling hands. "These should have died decades ago," he said. "There's no direct sunlight, no external water source. This ecosystem." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "It's self-sustaining." Doctor. Brooks, meanwhile, had moved towards the stone pillar. Her fingers traced the faint carving Edward had found. "Eliza," she whispered. Then she turned to Edward, her expression no longer just curious, but serious. "Mr. Lawson, do you understand what this is?" Edward swallowed. "I was hoping you would tell me." There was a long pause. Then she spoke. "This isn't just a hidden garden." She glanced around the chamber, her voice lowering. "This is a preserved historical site, possibly untouched for over 100 years. Edward felt his chest tighten. But she wasn't finished. "And if Eliza Whitmore built this—" She hesitated. "Then this place may be connected to one of the most mysterious disappearances in this region's history." Silence. "Heavy!" Unavoidable. Edward looked around the chamber once more, but this time, everything felt different. The beauty, the plants, the architecture. It wasn't just fascinating anymore. It was evidence of a story that had never been finished. And now, for the first time, Edward realized something far bigger than discovery. He hadn't just uncovered a secret. He had just reopened it. Edward Lawson stood silently as Dr. Amelia Brooks' words echoed through the underground chamber. A disappearance? Not just a forgotten artist, not just a hidden garden, a mystery. And somehow, he was now standing at the center of it. For the first time since he made the discovery. Edward felt something heavier than curiosity settle into his chest. Responsibility. Not the kind he had known in his career, tied to deadlines and paperwork, but something deeper. Something that couldn't simply be walked away from. He looked at the lilies again, their white petals glowing softly in the dim light. "They've been here all this time," he said quietly. Daniel nodded, still crouched beside them. And they shouldn't have survived. Not like this. This environment, it's controlled somehow. Whoever built this understood things we're only beginning to grasp even today. Edward exhaled slowly. Eliza Whitmore. The name no longer felt distant. It felt present. Alive in the walls, in the air, in every inch of the chamber. Doctor. Brooks stepped closer to Edward, her expression calm but firm. "You need to understand something. Mr. Lawson," she said. "Discoveries like this, they don't stay private for long." Edward's jaw tightened slightly. "I wasn't planning to make it public," he replied. "And you may not have a choice." The words hit harder than he expected. For a brief moment, something inside him resisted an instinct to protect what he had found. This place, it had chosen him, in a way, out of everyone. It was his shovel that struck the stone, his hands that uncovered the entrance, his discovery. But as quickly as that thought came, it began to fade. Because deep down, Edward knew the truth. This was never his to keep. He turned away from them, walking slowly across the chamber. His footsteps were quieter now, more deliberate. He wasn't exploring anymore. He was observing, listening, trying to understand the weight of what stood before him. "What happens next?" he asked, his voice steady but low. "Doctor?" Brooks didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the chamber, the architecture, the plants, the hidden light shafts, and then back at Edward. "That depends on you." Edward frowned slightly. "On me, you found it," she said. "That gives you a voice in what happens next. But once this is reported, and it will be reported, this land could be claimed for preservation. Research teams, officials, possibly even restricted access." Edward's eyes narrowed. Restricted? The word lingered. The quiet home he had bought, the life he had just begun building. It could all change overnight. For a moment, doubt crept in. Had he made a mistake? Should he have left it buried? But then his gaze returned to the lilies. No, some things weren't meant to stay hidden forever. Edward took a deep breath, straightening his posture as something within him finally settled into place. "When I moved here," he began slowly, "I thought I was buying a quiet place to finish out my years. No noise, no complications." He let out a soft, almost ironic laugh. "Guess life had other plans." Daniel gave a faint smile, but Edward's expression remained serious. "I don't know who Eliza Whitmore really was," he continued, "but I know one thing: she built this for a reason. And whatever that reason was, it mattered enough for her to hide it." "Doctor," Brooks watched him carefully. "And now?" she asked. Edward looked around the chamber one more time. Not as an outsider, not as a man who stumbled onto something strange, but as someone who had been given something. A responsibility. "We find out the truth," he said firmly. There was no hesitation in his voice now. No fear. Only purpose. "Doctor?" Brooks nodded slowly. "Then we do this properly." Edward turned back towards the staircase, the beam of his flashlight guiding the way. But this time, the darkness didn't feel as overwhelming. It didn't feel like something unknown waiting to consume him. It felt like something waiting to be understood. As they began to climb back up, Edward paused halfway and glanced back down into the chamber. The lilies were still there, unmoving, unchanged, waiting. And for the first time since he had uncovered the entrance, Edward didn't feel like he was intruding anymore. He felt like he belonged there. Not because it was his, but because he had chosen not to turn away from it. When they finally stepped back into the fading daylight, the world above felt different, brighter. Yes, but also smaller. Somehow. Less significant compared to what lay beneath. Edward stood in his backyard, staring at the ground that had once seemed so ordinary. A quiet country home? That's all he wanted. But now, he had something far greater. A mystery, a legacy, and a story that had been waiting over 100 years to be told. The news spread faster than Edward Lawson ever expected. Within weeks, what had once been a quiet, forgotten backyard in rural Vermont became the center of attention. Researchers arrived. Preservation officials walked the land with careful steps. Equipment, camera, and voices replaced the silence Edward had once cherished. And yet, Standing at the edge of it all, Edward didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt something else. Pride. Not for discovering the garden, but for choosing not to bury it again. The underground sanctuary was now carefully restored, not altered. Every stone was preserved, every plant protected. The hidden shafts were studied, their design praised as something far ahead of its time. Experts called it a masterpiece, a miracle. But Edward saw it differently. To him, it was a message, one that had waited over a century to be heard. On the day the site was officially unveiled to a small group of historians and guests, Edward stood quietly near the entrance. "Doctor." Amelia Brooks was speaking to the crowd, her voice steady as she explained the significance of the discovery. Eliza Whitmore was not just an artist, she said. She was a visionary. This underground garden wasn't built out of necessity. It was built out of intention, a place of solitude, of preservation, of control in a world that may have felt unpredictable. Edward listened, his eyes drifting toward the open staircase behind her. He remembered the first time he stood there, alone, unsure, afraid of what he might find. And now, there were people everywhere, cameras flashing, voices filled with awe. But somehow, the essence of the place hadn't changed. Later that evening, after the crowd had thinned and the sun began to set, Edward made his way back down into the chamber one last time alone. The air greeted him the same way it had the first time. Cool, quiet, timeless. The lilies were still there, unchanged. He walked slowly towards them, his steps softer now, almost respectful. "You waited a long time," he said quietly. His voice echoed gently through the chamber. "For someone to find you." He knelt down, looking closely at the delicate white petals. They no longer felt impossible. They felt intentional, like they were meant to endure. Just like everything else here. Edward exhaled deeply, a sense of calm settling over him. For the first time in his life, he understood something he had never truly grasped before. Not everything is meant to be owned. Some things are meant to be discovered, protected, and then shared. He stood up slowly, taking one last look around the chamber. This place had changed him, not because of what it was, but because of what it revealed. That even in the quietest corners of the world, beneath layers of time and silence, there are stories waiting patiently for someone willing to uncover them. Edward turned and began walking back toward the staircase. Each step upward felt different now. Lighter. Not because the mystery was gone, but because it had been given meaning. When he stepped back into the evening light, the sky stretched wide above him, painted in shades of orange and gold, the same backyard, the same home. But he was no longer the same man who had arrived there seeking nothing more than peace. He had found something greater, purpose. And as he stood there, looking out over the land that had once seemed so ordinary, Edward Lawson smiled not out of relief, but out of understanding. Because sometimes the most extraordinary parts of life aren't the things we go looking for. They're the things that find us when we least expect it. As the quiet finally returned to the Vermont countryside, Edward Lawson stood at the edge of the hidden staircase, no longer just a man who had uncovered something extraordinary, but someone who had chosen to give it meaning. Below him, the underground garden remained still and alive, its delicate balance untouched just as it had been for over a century. What was once forgotten was now protected. Edward stepped slowly down into the chamber, the soft air wrapping around him once again. The lilies stood in silence, just as they always had, no longer a mystery, but a message. He walked toward the stone pillar, his reflection faintly visible in the polished surface beside the carved name. Not a stranger anymore, not an intruder, but a keeper of something that mattered. He reached out not to uncover more, but to preserve what had already endured. because he understood now this hidden sanctuary, this fragile world buried beneath time, was never meant to belong to just one person. It was meant to be found by someone willing to protect it. The man who once searched for nothing more than peace had become the reason a forgotten story could live again, and the quiet backyard he thought he had purchased was now a place where history breathed beneath the surface. Because for Edward, and for everyone who would one day stand where he stood, this wasn't just a discovery. It was a responsibility, a chance to honor what came before, to protect what still remains, and to remember that even the things buried deepest in silence can still change the world above them. If this story moved you, hit like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories.